right, let's jump into a rivalry that I think is fascinating. India versus China. And we're going to focus on their defense capabilities. We're going to equip you with a breakdown of some data and analysis, really so you can get a handle on their military strengths. What's interesting to me right off the bat is that even though their defense budgets are wildly different, even the size of their air forces, there's so much more to this than meets the eye.
Oh, for sure. It's a really dynamic situation, very complex, two powerful nations constantly kind of adapting their strategies.
Exactly. And speaking of resources, that's a good place to start, I think. Their defense budgets, because there's a huge difference. In 2022, China put a massive $230 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars into their defense. That's more than 3 times what India spent, which was $70 billion. So what kind of impact does that have? I mean, just that sheer amount of money.
Well, that kind of funding allows China to really push forward with their military modernization. They have this goal of being fully modernized by 2027 and even more advanced by 2035.
Wow. So I'm assuming that puts a lot of pressure on India to keep up.
It does. It creates a real strategic challenge for them to keep pace with all those advancements.
Yeah, that's got to be tough. So let's dig into some of the specifics. Like, what about the actual manpower and equipment each country has?
Right. Well, when you look at that, you really see the disparities become clear. China has a much larger active military force, over 2 million personnel, compared to India's like 1.4 million.
Wow, okay.
And it's not just active duty, their reserve forces are significantly larger as well.
So it's not just the people, but it's the actual hardware.
Absolutely. China, they outnumber India when it comes to tanks. Armored vehicles, artillery, especially the kind that's self-propelled or uses rockets.
Oh, wow, okay.
And then this difference continues when we look at the air forces. China's air force, it's double the size of India's. Over 4,600 aircraft compared to India's 2,200.
So it sounds like China has a significant advantage in most areas. But I'm looking at our sources here, and it seems like when we focus on their air forces, things get a little more interesting. It says that even though they have fewer planes, the Indian Air Force might actually have some advantages. The IAF, they call it.
Yeah, that's an important point to make. Numbers don't always tell the whole story. It's about how effectively you can use what you have, right?
Mm.
And IF pilots, they actually have more experience in combat, particularly in high-altitude warfare, which is really important given the terrain along that border.
Right, the Himalayas. So, I mean, if you've got a pilot who's used to flying in that kind of environment, that's a huge plus.
It is, and their bases are strategically placed, too, which means they have really strong logistical support. That can be crucial in a conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Keeping those supply lines open. So it sounds like they're focusing on experience. And what was the other thing? Logistics?
Yeah, and then you have the types of aircraft. They focus on using aircraft that are known for their reliability, like the AH-64E Apache and the CH-47F Chinook. So, while China may have more aircraft, India's approach emphasizes quality, experience.
So it's not just quantity over quality. And here's something else that I think is really interesting. We hear a lot about China's J-20 stealth fighter. It's considered, a 5th-generation aircraft, cutting edge. But some experts actually argue that it might be inferior to India's 4.5-generation Rafale fighter jet. So you've got these defense analysts debating which one is actually better.
Yeah, it's a great example of how evaluating military tech is so complex. It's not just about the generation. There are so many factors to consider.
Right.
The takeaway here, I think, is that both countries are investing heavily in advanced fighter technology. They know how crucial it is in modern warfare.
Oh, for sure. So we're seeing this dynamic where China has this clear numerical advantage in a lot of areas. But India has its own strengths, especially when it comes to their air force. But to really understand this rivalry, you need to look at the historical context. I mean, that adds a whole other layer to this comparison.
It really does. History has a way of repeating itself, especially with these geopolitical rivalries. Right. We can't ignore the 1962 Sino-Indian War. India, they were caught off guard, and they suffered a defeat against the much larger Chinese force.
Right. And then fast forward to 2020, we see tensions flare up again in the Galwan Valley clash. It's like a reminder that those border disputes and the potential for escalation haven't gone away.
Exactly. Despite decades of diplomatic efforts, those issues are still major challenges in their relationship.
And now, of course, both countries are nuclear powers.
Right.
Which makes any potential conflict, a global concern. It makes you wonder what the fallout would be if things escalated.
It's definitely something to consider. especially with the economic ties both countries have with the rest of the world.
Right, right.
It's hard to imagine any nation remaining completely unaffected,
Yeah.
but let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much more to this. Maybe we haven't even touched on India's naval capabilities,
Yeah.
and we need to dig into those alliances and partnerships. It gets even more complex from here.
So, welcome back to our deep dive. Still comparing India and China's defense capabilities. I mean, as we've seen so far, this is not a simple thing to compare, and there are a lot of interesting elements.
Yeah, it's definitely not just, A plus B equals C here. We've talked about land power, we've talked about air power, but what about the seas?
Yeah.
I mean, with China's larger defense budget, they probably have a pretty big advantage there too, right?
You would think so, and you'd be right to a certain extent. China's naval strength is it's pretty impressive, pretty formidable. They have a larger navy than India. They have more aircraft carriers, more destroyers, more frigates, more corvettes, and more submarines.
So they definitely have more ships. But I'm curious, is it really just about numbers when it comes to naval power? Does India have anything working in its favor in this area?
Well, this is where geography becomes really important, I think. India's location gives it a strategic advantage, especially in the Indian Ocean. They control a lot of key choke points, these vital shipping lanes, and that gives them a certain amount of, well, leverage, I guess you could say.
So location, location, location. But how does India actually use that to their advantage?
Well, they've been modernizing their navy, focusing on what they call anti-access area denial capabilities. You might see it abbreviated as A2AD.
Okay, so what does that even mean?
Basically, they're developing strategies and weapons systems designed to stop adversaries from easily operating in the Indian Ocean.
So they're making it hard for anyone to just, come in and do what they want.
Exactly. It's kind of like they're creating a defensive bubble, protecting their maritime interests. They're investing in things like long-range missiles, very advanced submarines, and they're also really, really focusing on strengthening their coastal defenses.
That makes sense, especially with China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean. I mean, it's like a strategic chess match. Both sides are trying to anticipate the other's moves. But beyond all this hardware and geography, isn't there another piece of this puzzle? Like, what about alliances?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Alliances and international partnerships are hugely important. They play a crucial role in shaping the balance of power. India has been working really hard to strengthen its ties with countries like the US, Japan, Australia. They're forming these strategic partnerships, and that helps to counterbalance China's influence.
So it's like finding friends who share your concerns about a powerful neighbor.
Right.
There's strength in numbers. And these alliances, I mean, they can provide India with all sorts of things: diplomatic support, intelligence sharing, even the opportunity to participate in joint military exercises.
Right. And those collaborations, they not only boost India's defense capabilities, but they also, send a message. It tells China, you're not operating in a vacuum. The world is watching.
Actions have consequences.
Yeah.
So, given all this, how do you see India's defense strategy evolving as China continues to grow its military? What's like the long-term game plan?
It's pretty clear that India can't just try to match China's spending dollar for dollar. But that doesn't mean they don't have options. India is focusing on what are called asymmetric strategies.
Asymmetric strategies. Okay,
Yeah.
I like the sound of that. What does that actually mean?
Well, it's about recognizing that you don't always need to fight a head-on battle. If you know you're going to lose, you find other ways, more creative ways, maybe unconventional ways to level the playing field. India's investing a lot in areas like cyber warfare, space technology, and developing their own homegrown defense technologies.
So being adaptable, being tech savvy, maybe even a little unpredictable.
Exactly. They're also focusing more and more on what they call jointness, which is just basically closer integration, better coordination between their army, their navy, and their air force.
So they can respond quickly to new threats and really make the most of the resources they have.
Exactly.
So it sounds like India is really being proactive, adapting their strategies to counter China's growing military power.
They are, and this rivalry has implications beyond just India and China. I mean, it's shaping the entire Indo-Pacific region, and maybe even beyond that.
It makes you think about how interconnected global politics really is. We've just scratched the surface here, but I feel like I have a better understanding of this whole relationship now. It's so much more than just, counting tanks and planes.
It really is, and there's one more thing I think we need to explore: the role of technology in all of this.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive on India and China's defense capabilities. We've covered a lot of ground, budgets, manpower, geography, even alliances. But I think now it's time to talk about tech because it feels like that's changing the game. All these cutting-edge advancements are really changing the face of warfare, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, military power today, it's not just about the size of your army or how many tanks you've got. It's about, being able to use things like AI, artificial intelligence, drones, hypersonic missiles, and even, cyber warfare. These are the things that are really reshaping the strategic landscape.
So it sounds like India and China are both in this tech race. Are they focusing on similar things, or are they taking different approaches?
Well, there are similarities and differences, I guess. Both countries see how powerful AI is, and they're both investing a lot in research and development. They're both working on, AI-powered systems for intelligence analysis, targeting even autonomous weapons, which is kind of scary.
Autonomous weapons, that sounds like something out of, a sci-fi movie, like machines making decisions about life and death on the battlefield. That's a little unnerving.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's controversial for sure. There are ethical considerations we can't ignore. But the reality is that, this technology is developing really fast, and both India and China see its potential impact on future conflicts.
Okay, so AI is a big one. What about drones? It seems like everyone's using drones these days, from, delivering packages to military operations.
Yeah.
So how are India and China using drones?
Well, drones have become really essential in modern warfare, right? They can provide surveillance, do reconnaissance, and even carry out attacks, all without risking pilots. So both India and China have been expanding their drone fleets pretty rapidly, and they're both developing more and more sophisticated unmanned aerial vehicles.
I've heard about those Chinese Wing Loon drones. I think they've even been exported to other countries. What are those like?
Yeah, the Wing Lung. It's a good example of China's expertise in drones. It's a medium altitude, long endurance drone. So it can fly pretty high, it can stay in the air for a long time, and it can carry a bunch of different payloads, including precision guided munitions. It's been used in combat in a few places around the world, and it's proven to be really effective.
So China's definitely making its mark in the drone world. Is India keeping up?
Oh yeah, they're not just sitting back and watching. They're developing their own drones, their own indigenous technology. And they've also acquired some really advanced drones from countries like Israel and the US. They seem particularly focused on drones that can operate in those really challenging Himalayan mountains, high altitude, long endurance.
So both countries are really embracing drone technology. Now let's talk about hypersonic missiles. We hear a lot about those these days. Are they really the next big thing?
Well, they're definitely a game changer, I think. I mean, they travel at speeds greater than Mach 5, so 5 times the speed of sound. They're incredibly difficult to intercept. Both India and China are pouring resources into developing this tech because, well, if you can strike targets quickly and accurately, that's a huge advantage.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to defend against something moving that fast. But aren't hypersonic missiles super expensive and really complex to develop?
They are, yeah. I mean, that's why only a few countries have this technology. But, both India and China see them as really strategically critical. And they're willing to invest what it takes.
Wow, okay. So we've got AI, drones, hypersonic missiles. That's a lot of high-tech stuff. But what about cyber warfare? That seems like it's almost its own battlefield these days.
Yeah, cyber warfare it's potentially one of the most disruptive forms of conflict today because it's so hard to see. It involves attacking things like critical infrastructure, disrupting communications. You can spread misinformation, even manipulate financial systems. And both India and China have been accused of using cyber espionage and attacks against each other, I should say.
It's like a shadow war happening in the digital world, but it can cause real damage in the real world. It's almost scarier than traditional warfare because it's so hard to know where it's coming from.
Yeah, that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. It's a constant threat. And both India and China are investing in, strengthening their cyber defenses, but also developing their own offensive capabilities.
So technology is not just an add-on to their defense strategies. It's becoming like the core of their military power.
Yeah, you could say that the advancements we're seeing, they're changing the whole nature of warfare, and it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.
This deep dive has been it's been really eye-opening. We've covered so much, and it's clear that the India-China rivalry it's complex, it's constantly changing. So as we wrap up, what are your final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that this rivalry goes beyond just military hardware. It's about strategic thinking. It's about technological innovation. And really, it's about this constant, maneuvering for advantage in a world that's changing all the time.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into, India and China's defense capabilities. We hope you've learned something new and maybe even have some things to think about.